Well, thank you for joining us, Noel. We have a bunch of our very great customers here today to hear from you about what's going on. A lot of people I know are interested in the Port of Long Beach and what's happened over the past quarter or two, and then what to expect moving into next year with all the different variables that are impacting global supply chains and trade. So we're really happy to have you here. I want to thank all of our valued customers for joining us today. We want to be able to provide each and every one of you with valuable experiences to be able to understand what's going on in the industry, the different paths that the supply chain is taking, and how to best arm yourselves with the information necessary to have a resilient and agile supply chain, hopefully through partnership with Cargomatic. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to my good friend, Noel Hacegaba, Deputy Executive Director for the Port of Long Beach. He's really the mover and shaker out here in the industry. He's been a great representative of the San Pedro Bay Port Authorities with the American Association of Port Authorities and IANA and so many different national organizations. And Noel, thank you again for doing this for us. And I'll kick it over to you to hear what's going on at the Port of Long Beach.
Thanks, Weston. That's very kind of you. Appreciate the invitation and that kind of welcome. Also appreciate you and Cargomatic, everything that you do to keep our complex competitive and moving in the right direction. And thank you for providing this forum to address your customers, our mutual customers. Happy to give you our outlook on what things may look like over the next 6 to 8 months. But I think it's important before we talk about the future that we receive it in its proper context. So what I did, Weston, is I put together a slide deck that I'm going to breeze through just to give the audience that context that I think is helpful, that will then explain why I think things may look the way that we expect them to. And what you see on the screen right now is our container volumes here at the Port of Long Beach over the last several years. And you'll see that after hitting bottom in 2019, when we were going through the then disruption, which was the US-China trade war, things started going up on an upward trajectory beginning in 2020. Little did we know in the first half of 2020 that the global pandemic that was triggered by COVID would actually move the market in a positive direction. So as you can see, in 2020, we hit an all-time high of 8.11 million TEU, and that was followed in 2021 by 9.38 million TEU. And what was different about this disruption is that the traditional peaks and valleys that we typically see were replaced by this ongoing tsunami, this ongoing wave that commenced in the summer of 2020, catapulted us to record years in 2020 and 2021. And if we advance this chart, you'll see that in 2022, it's looking a lot like 2021. In fact, for the first 6 months of 2022, every single month, we're seeing record months, right? But what's important to note is that beginning in May of 2022, we began to detect a slowdown in volumes. In fact, when you take out empty containers, which is counted as part of our total throughput, what you'll see is that our loaded imports peaked in May at about 437,000 TEU, and they continued on a decline. And in fact, in October, which is the latest reporting of our cargo volumes, we were at about 294,000 TEU. So we began to see the softening in the market as early as May, and we expect that to continue through the end of this year. In fact, for Q4, we're already seeing 28 blank sailings just for the Port of Long Beach alone, which represents about 15% of our vessel capacity. So things will continue to go on a slower trajectory going forward. I think it's important to note that some of the global factors that you alluded to are going to be very important in telling in how the market shapes out. We were encouraged by the inflation report in October that inflation didn't grow at the same rate. It looks like it could be slowing down. That's certainly going to help the market. Inventory levels is another metric we keep a close eye on. A lot of the big retailers have been reporting inventory levels to the tune of 20 to 30% year over year. So that's another factor. But then when you look at freight rates overall, you'll see that they have they have significantly plummeted. And so there's also economic factors at play. And of course, the overall health of not just the US economy, but the global economy. So there's a lot of factors, there's a lot of issues, if you will, that we're going to have to sift through to try to interpret and figure out how the market's going to shape out. The consensus is that things will continue on a downward trajectory through the end of this calendar year, possibly for the first couple of months of next year. But then after Lunar New Year, things may start to pick up again, largely dependent on what happens with the overall economy, the weight of inflation, and how consumers react. What's interesting about this is that even with high inflation, the latest report shows that we as consumers continue to buy. We continue to buy products, we continue to buy services. I think a lot of that has to do with we as consumers trying to take advantage of the bargains as retailers try to unload a lot of their heavy inventory. So it'll be interesting to see what actually shapes out next year. But before I jump into that, again, let me walk you through the last 18 months, because I think what's going to happen over the next 6-8 months is going to be a continuation of what we saw over the last 18 months. What you see here on the slide is what all of us know. We felt it, we experienced it. In 2021, retail imports were literally through the roof. And that was, again, driven by the high demand during the COVID lockdowns, et cetera. And then on the second slide, you'll see what impact that had on operations. One of the immediate impacts is that our warehouse and distribution center capacity was fully subscribed. As a matter of fact, even today in the Inland Empire, which is for us about 2 billion square feet of warehouse DC space just within 75 miles of our port complex, the vacancy rate is about 1%. And it really hasn't moved much. And so that became the root cause for a lot of the issues that we experience here at the port complex. As you'll see on the next slide, we saw ships at anchor. At one point, they peaked at 109. And a lot of people asked us at the time, what's normal? How many ships at anchor do you typically have? And the answer was 0. So in January of this year, we were 109 ships above normal. And so thanks to the quick work of the Marine Exchange and PMSA and PMA, we were able to amend the queuing system and get the majority of those ships dispersed across the Pacific Ocean. And more recently, thanks to the softening in the market, we have 0 ships at anchor. We have berth availability today, which is in contrast to some of the other gateways on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. There is capacity here in LA Long Beach. We have the berth capacity. We certainly can handle any number of ships. But then on the second screen, you'll see that not only were ships serving as warehouses on the water, but our terminals were also being utilized, if you will, as warehouses. We saw containers piling up in record numbers. Most of our terminals were reporting being at over 100% capacity. I didn't even think that was possible, but a lot of these containers were out of spot, and they were doing their absolute best to try to manage through this situation. With nowhere for these containers to go, our terminals were doing their absolute best to try to maximize every square inch of their terminals. And that's what really led us as port authorities to step up and figure out ways to address some of the congestion. Dwell, for example, before COVID was about 2.5 days. Average number of days a container sat in a terminal yard between discharge and exit through the gate. During the height of the pandemic, that was as high as 8, sometimes 9 days. So you could see that the congestion really impacted velocity through the yard. We'll go on to the next slide. Chassis were also dislocated in historic numbers. They were also used as floating warehouses, and they continue to be utilization and on-street dwell continues to be at an elevated level as well. They peaked at about 10 days. Right now, it's down about 8 days. Next slide, please. So let me tell you now how we responded and what the ports did in response to this crisis. The first thing we did is we discovered that there was one of the most glaring gaps was the lack of visibility, the lack of data. In fact, when we went from a record number of blank sailings in the first half of 2020 to the beginnings of a record wave of cargo, it caught our railroads, it caught our dray companies, it caught the warehouse sector completely off guard. They were not prepared for that onslaught of cargo. And so we dedicated ourselves to gathering data in large quantities. If you go to our website today, you'll see that we have data for every conceivable category of metrics so that our customers, all of you who are watching now, can have access to that and then use that data in real time to plan your operations. But let me go back to an earlier slide. Not only did we go and get the data in record numbers, but the second thing we did is we repurposed vacant land inside the port to make sure that we were providing that immediate relief to our terminals. And what we did is we started with 17 acres at Pier S in Long Beach. And those 17 acres over time grew to its current footprint, which is 100 acres. And I can't tell you how valuable that became, not just for our terminals, but for our shippers as well, who now had an opportunity to send in their trucks to pick up containers at this satellite yard. In fact, this operation that we call STORE, which stands for Short-Term Overflow Resource, became so successful that other gateways across the country started replicating it. And in fact, they're now known as pop-up yards, but the very first one was here at Pier S, at Pier Store. And as you can see on the slide, these 100 acres have an annual throughput capacity of about a million TEU per year. So just it came in right on the heels of LBCT completing their third phase, which added another million TEU of throughput capacity. Could not have come at a better time. But the other action we took, if you go on to the next slide, is we worked with our terminals to expand their hours of operation. TTI was the first to introduce 24-hour operations. To this day, they're open 24 hours a day, 4 days a week. Soon, every other terminal across the San Pedro Bay Ports Complex started opening earlier, closing later, opening on weekends, Saturdays primarily, but some of them on Sundays as well. And today we have 3 terminals in the complex that have some form of 24-hour operations. As a matter of fact, when the Port Envoy and the White House Supply Chain Disruptions Task Force was working with the ports and the stakeholders here, President Biden himself embraced this notion of expanding hours of service and hours of operation here at the ports. But of course, we knew then that this was just one light switch among many, many others that would have to be flicked in order to get to a true 24-hour supply chain. And then, of course, the other action that we took that was the least popular, but I must admit that we had to use every tool at our disposal, is we announced a fee that would be levied against the ocean carriers for long dwell inbound containers, defined as containers sitting in terminal 9 days or longer. The good news is this, Weston, we have not implemented the fee because all of you responded. The industry, the port ecosystem responded in extraordinary fashion. Everyone did their part, and we started evacuating these long dwell containers in record numbers, both on the inbound and outbound side. We saw a record number of blank sailings to evacuate empties. We saw shippers and the railroads and the shipping lines collaborate in ways that we'd never seen before. And you can see some of the results on the next few slides. You'll see that as of yesterday, the reduction in these long dwell inbound containers compared to November 1st, which is around the time that we announced this fee, is down 92%. Now just think about that, 92% reduction. And again, thanks to the extraordinary collaboration and everyone doing their part, all hands on deck. Of course, as you see on the same slide, we are seeing an uptick in empties. Thankfully, the softness on the inbound side is providing that relief to our terminals. But there again, that illustrates why it's important to have access to nearby surge capacity sites like Pier Store. Let me advance to the next slide there. One of our biggest pain points in recent months has been on the IPI intermodal side. The rail system in the US has been out of balance for some time. And as you can see there on the chart, the number of long dwell IPI boxes sitting in terminal peaked at over 15,000, which was about 5 times normal. But thankfully, again, thanks to the coordination between the railroads, the ocean carriers, and the terminals, evacuating older freight first, That is down significantly, under 1,000 boxes. So again, remarkable progress, all thanks to the port ecosystem coming together, the stakeholders finding a way to work together, everyone doing their part. And a huge shout out to the port and supply chain envoy, General Steve Lyons, who continues to convene these weekly meetings with all the stakeholders. And these meetings have now expanded. When we started having these meetings last October, they were primarily focused on San Pedro Bay. Today, we get reports and we have discussions with other gateways, including New York, New Jersey, Georgia, Oakland, and other gateways, Houston. So a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of time invested in getting the U.S. supply chain up and running. Let me quickly run through the last remaining slides, Weston. I really want to give you and the audience a chance to ask questions. On the IPI side, one thing I do want to let you know is even at the height of COVID, we never stopped pursuing and proceeding with our capital expansion plans. Why? Because we knew that at some point we were going to get out of the immediate crisis, and it was important for us to continue to prepare for the future. So our Pier B on-dock rail support facility is the centerpiece of our $2.7 billion CapEx program that we continue to move forward. And I can tell you how important this is going to be in the future in order for us as a complex to handle historic amounts of containers. And here's one of the bright spots in all of this. You know how they say that there's always a silver lining and there's always something good that comes out of an unpleasant experience? Well, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you how the government responded. First, the federal government, the bipartisan infrastructure law, also known as IIJA, that provided $1.2 trillion over the coming years to invest in our infrastructure. $17 billion of that dedicated to ports and waterways. And this funding in these historic amounts are what we need to continue supporting the infrastructure that's going to enable the supply chain to move records amount of volumes. Not to be left behind, if you look on the next slide, our own state, Governor Newsom signed the state budget that allocated $2.3 billion for goods movement and supply chain projects. That will net at least $870 million for the two ports here in Southern California. And there are more funding opportunities to support not just our capital programs, but other forms of infrastructure initiatives that are critical for our competitiveness and our success. For example, on the next slide, there's a workforce development goods movement training campus that we are collaborating with Port of Los Angeles, the ILWU, and the PMA. This is going to be a state-of-the-art goods movement training campus to ensure we have the workforce of the future here at the Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles to make sure that we're ready, we're capable to move records amounts of volumes. And on the next slide, not to be left behind, the digital infrastructure that needs to be paired with our physical infrastructure is going to be critical in order for us to move more containers. I like to say that the flow of physical containers largely depends on the flow of data and information. And this supply chain information highway initiative that we launched last December is already getting tremendous momentum. It's a great corollary to what the Department of Transportation is doing with its flow initiative, what the FMC is doing with its Maritime Transportation Data Initiative. And basically what we're doing is we're liberating the data. We found a way to get all the data points and all the exchange points together under one common corridor. And if you think about all these tools that are currently on the market today that have as its objective to make data available and share information, if you view those as cars that carry data, we're building the highway, we're building the freeway, where all these different tools and all these different sources of data can travel on one common corridor. And as you'll see on the next slide, there are tremendous benefits, so much so that other ports around the country have agreed to join us. The Port of Oakland, the Northwest Seaport Alliance, Port Miami, the South Carolina Ports Authority, and even Utah Inland Port Authority, they've agreed to join us in building this out so that it really becomes a national initiative. But let me move on to the last portion of my remarks. We'll skip ahead to the next slide. Because as you know, Weston, here in Southern California, very proud to be leaders, not just when it comes to capital infrastructure, security, and efficiencies, but we continue to raise the bar when it comes to sustainability and our stewardship as partners in the community. And the latest iteration of our Cleaner Action Plan set some very ambitious goals that you'll see on the next few slides. Zero emissions cargo handling equipment by 2030. The funding that I referenced earlier, both by the federal and state government, are going to be instrumental in enabling us to be able to meet and our partners to meet those goals. And then on the next slide, zero emissions trucks by 2035. Very encouraged by how the industry is responding so far. You know, over the next 4 years here in Long Beach alone, we're going to have over 100 charging stations. And right now, while it is true that a very small number of trucks are zero emissions, in fact, I'll tell you the number, it's 38. With these charging stations and with all the investments and the concerted effort to get our industry up and running to meet these goals, we're very, very optimistic that we're going to meet these goals well ahead of time. So I'll end my remarks with that. Weston, happy to take questions from you in the audience, but again, appreciate the opportunity.
Maybe I should get myself off mute there. So thanks again for joining. And what a great presentation. It's really good to get the context of how did we get where we are today, right? Because sometimes people forget that this all happened very quickly, and even the drop off happened pretty quickly. I think we all knew that there were some external, things that were going to happen, things like inventory carrying over from last year that missed key holiday dates, things like Halloween, the Christmas holiday season, back to school, even some things like Valentine's Day and whatnot, where inventory was carried over, which created surpluses. But then also, ever since 2014, anytime there's a contract negotiation on the West Coast, you see planning and rerouting of vessels. So I think there's a lot that goes into how we got where we are today, why we saw so much cargo in the first half of the year, why we saw a shift in the second half of the year. And I really love what you guys are doing around the digitizing of the supply chain. Obviously, we're a technology company who moves freight. We provide end-to-end visibility through our OneSource platform for our customers, from the time, the on the water reports all the way to the time it's delivered. And it's a big part of our value proposition. But to your point, you can only put the data into your system that's out there and available. And what we've noticed is a lot of the datable's available. A lot of the data needs to be refined. But at the same time, you need to know who to ask and where to ask. So streamlining that process will help companies like ours provide end-to-end supply chain visibility for our customers in a much more sophisticated manner, even more so than we're doing today. So thank you for that. But before I hop into the Q&A that we'll ask, I just want to remind everybody, there's a little button at the bottom. It says Q&A. If you have any questions, we have about 10-15 minutes that we're going to go through the Q&A part of this. So feel free to enter any questions in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get to all of the questions. But I think the first one I want to start with is going into next year. I talked about the crystal ball being murky as to when does supply chain congestion ease up, and as we saw, it happened very quickly, right? So murky crystal balls typically mean very quick market corrections, if you will. So going into next year, I've talked to terminal operators that are preparing for a lot of volume coming in. After Q1, a lot of people use Lunar New Year as kind of a line of demarcation as to when they start thinking we'll see volumes uptick again. We've heard customers that are saying the same thing. Again, looking at some of those same, we'll call them external impacts and how they play out between now and then. And then the other part is, talking with different ocean carriers. We've spoken with some that are seeing orders come in already for next year. We've got other ones that are saying they think it may be light a little bit later. What's the Port of Long Beach seeing? What are you guys hearing? And what are you guys planning for as we get through the first half of, let's say, of next year?
Yeah, thanks, Weston. We're hearing a lot of the same that you are hearing, right? And what we do, our approach is talk to as many people as we can from every segment of the supply chain and try to synthesize the information so that we can reach our own conclusions. But what you said is basically what we expect. Our outlook for the next year, the first half of 2023, is that the first couple of months, preceding Lunar New Year. They're going to look more like what we've seen the last couple of months here, with the market softening, with blank sailings and volumes continuing to dip, certainly on the inbound side. But after Lunar New Year, we expect an uptick, as we typically do. And what we're hearing from shippers is that there's an expectation that things will rebound, right? At some point, those elevated inventory levels that we continue to hear about in the quarterly earnings reports, those levels will dissipate. And as you and I both know, we as consumers have become very picky, and we want our products in the right season. And so there's this demand for products, whether it's fast fashion or sneakers or the latest gadget, and that's going to continue to drive the market. One thing I'm going to that I would say we're going to keep a close eye on is consumer spending. Notwithstanding record inflation, notwithstanding what most economies predict will be a recession over the next few months, we as consumers continue to spend at a record pace. And granted, we continue to spend with credit, but we continue to spend, and that's the lifeblood of the economy. So as long as the consumption continues, and again, I want to say this to all the viewers here, take advantage of the bargains, because they're out there, and come, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, the holiday season, there will be tons of bargains. And I think that's what's happening. Everyone's trying to take advantage of that. So then the question is, what happens after that uptick following Lunar New Year? That's the big question mark. I think that's where the crystal balls diverge. I've heard some say that things will continue on an uptick. As you pointed out, we're hearing from some shippers that they're placing their orders early, try to hedge any congestion following the Lunar New Year. But we're also hearing that some orders are being canceled. And we are hearing that some of the shipping lines are taking a tepid approach, and they're going to continue to optimize their vessel fleets in anticipation of a downturn. So I think a lot of that, the second half of next year, is going to largely be dependent on what happens to the overall economy, vis-a-vis inflation, vis-a-vis a possible recession, vis-a-vis the confidence for consumers to continue to spend.
100%. And I think that's what we're all waiting on is this has been one of the most unique economic times I've seen. It isn't a true recession by any stretch of the imagination. You've got a lot of, again, just different factors that are impacting how things are going to progress. But as you said, everybody's looking at inflation and interest rates, but credit card interest rates are the same as they were previously.
That's right.
Consumer spending habits are on an uptick. And even in some of the brands we talk to, instead of they're not seeing less sales. What they're seeing is, in some cases, maybe a change in the brand. So if they own multiple fashion brands, instead of going with the premium designer brand, they're going maybe with the mid-tier brand. But you're still seeing products move at a record pace, which leads us again into next year. I think and you talked about bargains just quickly, folks. $1,300 from Asia to the Port of Long Beach on the spot market right now. You can't ask for a better time to buy your ocean shipping rates. Bring it over. There's berth space. We've got truck capacity. We're happy to help. But I joke. But if you look at it, right, one of the other big questions that I think a lot of folks are asking is, have we seen a significant permanent change in trade routes from the West Coast to the East Coast, right? If you read any of the publications out there, whether it be the JOC or more mainstream media like CNBC or Bloomberg, who have gotten really engaged in supply chain, you see some headlines that'll say, there's going to be a permanent shift. New York, New Jersey's here to stay. I heard that in 2014 as well. But what is the Port of Long Beach doing, right? Because you talk about the 2 billion square feet of warehousing, you talk about the infrastructure, you talk about the investments, and how we can be better prepared the next time we have peaks, if you will. What's the Port of Long Beach doing to regain market share moving into next year? And why are you the port of choice? I think that's the one thing that people are wondering is, do you expect the volume to come back, and what are you doing to win it back?
Thank you, Weston. I love your passion. As a matter of fact, you just gave me a ton of ideas of how we could promote our brand. But your question is spot on. What we've been doing and what we will continue to do is play the long game, right? Even during COVID, we continue to press forward with our capital expansion programs. Why? Because we knew that this disruption, as severe as it was, at some point was going to end. And we kept the foot on the gas. We continue to deliver. We delivered LBCT, third phase. We delivered a new bridge. We're moving forward with our Pier Beyond Dock Rail Support Facility. It's things like that, Weston, that will continue to differentiate ports like ours, because our customers will always know that this is where the capacity is. This is where the efficiencies are. This is where we have partners like Cargomatic and others who see what we're doing, and they will pair their operations and their investments in innovation to match what we're doing and offer customers that value proposition. But I will also say this, your question about diversion, every time there's diversion, it's always temporary. In fact, I've come up with a new word, the diversion of the cargo that typically comes to Southern California. I will say it's transitory. It'll eventually come back. Why? Because this is where the scale is. This is where the flexibility is. Who else? Where else in the nation, in the world, do you have 12 different container terminals? The capacity that we've demonstrated we can deliver on and execute on over the last couple of years. We moved 20 million container units in 2022. It's amazing what the two ports are capable of doing. And as we continue to invest in our infrastructure, we continue to work with our partners like Cargomatic and every segment of the supply chain, the class ones, the short haul rail operator, the chassis leasing companies. As we continue to work and partner and collaborate with our port ecosystem, imagine what we could do together, right? So we're very bullish. We're very optimistic about what we're building here at Weston. And again, that's why I thank you for the opportunity to let our mutual customers know that if they invest in Long Beach and Los Angeles and Southern California, they're in good hands.
Yeah, we have one question that came in, and you talked about chassis. So obviously, since the pool of pools was created, I think that the chassis providers, good, bad, or indifferent, fair or unfair, have been at the center point of a lot of the conversation around congestion and efficiency. 6 weeks ago, you couldn't find a chassis at any terminal. Now, I follow the Harbor Trucking Association reports, and you see hundreds, and in some cases over 1,000 chassis at different terminals. The question was really about what's the future of the chassis game in Southern California, and what should shippers be looking to do to prepare themselves for highs and lows in the market, because obviously, you talked about dwell, it's down to 8 days roughly. Really, the pool was built for 3.5 days of external dwell. We've seen more and more private pools being created for different e-commerce type shipping services. We see a lot more private chassis out in the market to combat, chassis dislocation. What from the Port of Long Beach's stance, because you guys are so in the middle of really as a facilitator and helping strategize so customers don't see the delays. What do you guys see as the future of the chassis market here in Southern California?
Everything you just described, Weston, about how the chassis leasing space and market is changing, I think is evidence of what that eventually is going to turn into. When we first convened the pool of pools here back in 2014, 2015, the whole idea was to create a model where three distinct companies that are profit making could pool their resources, right, to offer better efficiencies to the market. But what's happened since that time, and I would say that was an important step, and that first step really elevated and got us past some pain points that preceded that model, I will say, because the dislocations before then were really out of control. But what's happened since, as you pointed out, is there's been a shift in the market. The market share of the pool of pools has fallen, and there have been a number of new entrants, primarily private parties, whether it's shippers or even trucking companies themselves, or even the chassis leasing companies offering premium services, right? All that to me signals that folks want to be in control of their own destiny. They don't want to rely on a model. They don't want to rely on someone else. And to me, one of the lessons learned coming away from the supply chain disruption is that to the extent that you can have that control, to the extent that you can have access to that surge capacity, you have access to the resources you need to move your cargo, folks are going to rethink that. And it's interesting, right? Because when you track the history of chassis, historically owned and operated and managed by the shipping lines. When they divested, that created this new market. It created this new model, if you will. Some would say it created an extra layer of complexity. But one of the lessons learned, I think, coming away from this is folks are going to want to control their destiny. And to me, that signals that more and more entities are going to want to have their own chassis fleets or access to their own chassis. So it remains to be seen. I mean, we are obviously in constant talks with our chassis leasing company partners. We're still fully behind the pull of pulls. We'd love to see that number come down. I will say to your customers that just in the last week, on-street dwell dropped from almost 10 days. It's under 9 days. It's like 8.5 days as of this week. And with the market softening, that should continue to come down. But like you said, Weston, we all will benefit if that number is where it needs to be. And that will continue to be an item that we'll keep a close eye on.
Yeah, one more question before we let folks go. And then after you answer this question, I'll leave it to you for closing remarks. But you brought up the investment that government's making, but you also talked about the Clean Air Action Plan. And as we know, California very much so is the land of regulation, which has in some cases positive impacts, in some cases negative impacts. We had a question here about what will happen to the trucking supply. As you know, the California Trucking Association, the Harbor Trucking Association have come out and said, and you guys have validated this, as much as a third of the trucking capacity servicing California's ports would be essentially disqualified until they get the proper truck and or purchase order for the proper equipment. Can you talk a little bit about what the Port of Long Beach is doing on that front as it relates to clean trucks and what shippers should be looking out for? Obviously, from our standpoint, we have near zero emissions trucks. We're looking at becoming zero emissions ready with the proper infrastructure. We work with partner carriers who we're validating and making sure that they all have the 2014 model year engine or newer so they can continue to go in and out of the port. But there are many customers out there that probably don't even ask that question when they're looking, or I should say shippers. Our customers, by and large, ask about the ESG requirements and qualifications. But talk a little bit about what, if you were importing and you were coming through the Port of Long Beach, what would you be looking for in procurement of truck power? Because I think it's going to change significantly for many importers come January 1.
I would say plan for the long game, right? When you plan out your investments in motor power, make sure it's long term. I believe, and again, I'm an optimist as hard as you know, Weston, that a lot of these regulations and these targets that have been put out there, whether it's the clean truck and bus rule by CARB, or even our own with the Cleaner Action Plan, what we're seeing already in the response by the industry is that folks are willing to get ahead. Like I said, over the next 3 to 4 years here in Long Beach alone, we'll have 100 charging stations. That charging infrastructure is just going to help us move the ball forward as it relates to zero emissions trucks. I will say this as well, for those who have trucks that still have life left in their engines that are not quite zero emission, that's the reason why in Long Beach, we took a very aggressive stance on a bridge of low NOx trucks. And so those exemptions are still available. We want to be as pragmatic as we can. It doesn't mean that we're anti-zero emission. On the contrary, what we are is we are fully in on zero emissions, but we're pragmatists. We understand where the market is. We understand that a lot of these engines are not commercially viable or available today at scale. So what we've tried to do as a Port Authority is create a path for those that need a transition. But for your customers in particular who are looking at investment plans, I would say plan for the long haul. Invest in zero emissions. We're going to continue to do our best. As you know, we have a clean truck rate. It's a fund that we're gathering that will help us and help our dray community upgrade to zero emissions trucks. We're going to collect about $90 million a year between the two ports. Our intent is to incentivize, to enable, and to help our drayage community get there. And lastly, as you pointed out, Weston, we do operate in a very unique operating environment, right? But we're proud of our resume. In fact, some people may not know this, but we were the very first green port. And what's interesting is when we travel the world and meet with other port authorities, there are other ports now that are replicating our programs, and they call themselves the Green Port. So we're a testament that you can grow green. And just like our partners, industry partners responded the last time around in the first iteration of Clean Trucks program, we have every confidence they will again. And we couldn't do it without them. We couldn't do it without them. And finally, our retailers are telling us they want us to raise the bar on ESG. Of course, they want us to do it in a measured way. They want us to do it in a pragmatic way, and we're with them. But I think I'm just very bullish on our ability as a port ecosystem to meet those goals.
Thank you so much. I'll leave it to you. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I'm going to sign off now, but I'll let you say goodbye to the folks, give any closing comments, what people should be looking for. We're sitting here a year from now. Where do we see the market? Noel, thank you so much. Really appreciate it, buddy. And we look forward to doing this at the end of each quarter, looking at a recap of what's happened and what to plan for. And thank you for your continued partnership.
You got it, Weston. And we're on the eve of Thanksgiving, so I wish all of you and your families and loved ones happy Thanksgiving.